As is often the case, I feel it best to begin our journey today with a few disclaimers. First of all, this review is based on the PS4 version of Warhammer Chaosbane. While the PC version may be referenced in passing, the PS4 version is the one on which my thoughts are based. This is mainly because it rarely seems to go on sale on PC, and also I happened to find the PS4 version behind a dumpster at my local supermarket. Secondly, this review is based on the vanilla version of the game, and does not cover the apparently lackluster DLC. Thirdly, much like many of my other reviews, this will be a single-player affair, and does not cover the game's multiplayer features. Of course, the main reason for this is that is my preferred manner of playing most games, and it has absolutely nothing to do with my crippling social anxiety and general lack of friends. Fourthly, and finally, if you enjoyed this review, please consider supporting my attempts to find games to review behind local dumpsters by liking, subscribing and sharing. If you don't, it's fine, but I'll probably die penniless in a ditch. Not so long ago, I reviewed Warhammer Inquisitor Martyr on the channel. In the months since I published that review, a question has come up several times in the comments. Is this game better than Warhammer Chaosbane? Now, such a question requires nuance, even if it's one that can be boiled down to a very simple answer. Developed by Echo Software. If it's Echo, why is it spelt like this? Echo Software. Why isn't it spelt like the normal way? A developer with a varied set of titles to their name, Warhammer Chaosbane is an isometric loot-based ARPG, and for many, the footage that I'm showing here, and that brief description, is all they'll need to understand exactly what kind of experience this game offers. Unfortunately, such a truth is absolute when it comes to Chaosbane, and while not the worst example of its genre, its overtly safe approach ultimately produces a game that altogether feels like a waste of the license and its deep, multifaceted lore. In short, the attempt to innovate is sorely missing in this relatively by-the-numbers ARPG. Now, let's get this out of the way up front. While Chaosbane is technically the same genre as Martyr, the differences are large enough that it quickly becomes clear that more suitable games exist with which to compare it. Other than the obvious positioning within the 40k and Warhammer Fantasy brands, Martyr described itself as a tactical ARPG, favouring slower, heavier gameplay and elements like cover and careful positioning over fast-paced movement. Chaosbane, instead, is in more of the Diablo 3 mould, aspiring to create a slicker, quicker, high-numbers game with smaller health pools and larger replay value. But despite such differences, comparing the two does at least allow for Chaosbane's biggest issue to be highlighted: its clear and unfortunate lack of ambition. Martyr was an example of a small team with a limited budget and big ideas, pushing to innovate and experiencing various levels of success. Chaosbane instead plays it safe, and what few new ideas it brings feel half-baked and non-committal, meaning that when all is said and done, what we are left with is a competent, generic, dulled ARPG which both fails to bring anything new to the table and also underuses the very property in which it exists. Okay, so let's talk about Warhammer Fantasy lore for a moment. Unlike in 40k, scale is slightly less of a defining feature in Warhammer Fantasy, with proceedings taking place across one large world instead of a seemingly infinite universe of planets and races. Don't get me wrong, there is still enough detailed lore here to sink your teeth into, but it is one defined by the magnitude of particular incidents throughout the history of one world, rather than one defined by huge-scale, never-ending conflict and the endless decaying nature of humanity's place within an uncertain and dangerous future. However, while such a focus on scale is toned down in fantasy compared with 40k, that doesn't mean that it's absent entirely. In recent years, the biggest large-scale event within the IP's lore was the End Times story arc, which led to a relaunch and simplification of the tabletop game, now rebranded as Warhammer Age of Sigmar. While I could never do such a complicated and nuanced story justice in this brief description, the essential premise of End Times was a literal end-of-the-world scenario, which led to the birth of a new existence in which certain elements were kept and others were reset. Think of it like a soft reboot for Warhammer Fantasy. However, rather than leveraging one of the massive conflicts seen in the End Times arc, like some other games within the Warhammer IP, Chaosbane instead seeks to go back into Warhammer's vast history, setting itself some 300 plus years before the End Times, during the reunification of mankind against the ever-present and ever-threatening Chaos Hordes. Such a setting is an interesting one, and allows for genuine opportunities to explore some of the more poignant characters from the franchise's history, including the infamous Magnus, an important figure within Warhammer lore. Unfortunately, Chaosbane squanders such an opportunity by telling an unengaging, generic, and bland tale that is further hindered by strange narrative choices. In short, in this tale of Warhammer Fantasy's many races and armies coming together against a common foe, the only elements that stand out are the ones that serve to confuse the narrative, and everything else ends up feeling as formulaic as the concept would suggest. As an example, at the start of the game, the player finds the aforementioned Magnus near death along with the many corpses of his troops strewn around him. When reinforcements arrive, they accuse you of being the culprit, and a huge point is made of the player being accused of a crime they didn't commit. Such narrative framing, while not completely original, could create an interesting footing with which to start the story, as the player tries to first prove their loyalty before moving on with the adventure. However, this idea is actually completely abandoned within the very same cutscene, when another character just walks in and says, "Nah, it wasn't them, they're cool," and everyone else goes, "Oh, okay, no worries, sorry about that." This inevitably leads to the question of why such events were included in the first place. This initial lack of trust never comes up again and foreshadows nothing, so why was it there? This is just one example of several of these weird narrative choices that serve only to make the player disengage and make the story more convoluted. On top of this, the story is either told as flat in-game dialogue, which has its own problems, but we'll get to those later, or as an animated 2D cutscene. While I understand that the budget wasn't massive, and I've enjoyed this method of storytelling in the past, for some reason these didn't quite land for me with Chaosbane, failing to draw me in and instead feeling disconnected from the rest of the game. All in all, such elements culminate in an unfortunate waste of an interesting period in Warhammer's past, which fails to both tell an interesting story or draw the player into its world. When Chaosbane first launched in May of 2019, it had 4 class options available to the player. Alessa, a Wood Elf archer who favours distance and dodge rolls. Bragi, a dwarf barbarian whose tanky endurance makes him perfect for standing his ground. Elontir, a high elf mage who uses various powerful spells for both high DPS and AoE damage. And Volin, a human warrior who acts as the closest thing that Chaosbane has to an all-rounder. Since then, the developer has added a free 5th playable character, a dwarf engineer named Keeler, who favours a combination of turrets and traps alongside close-quarters hammer-based combat. To Chaosbane's credit, each of these classes feel distinct from one another and are competently executed when it comes to gameplay. But despite such praise, it once again feels like playing it safe won out over innovation here. While there are some interesting ideas, such as Alessa being able to refill her ability meter by navigating her way to her wandering spirit companion, or Elontir's controllable orb attack, which must be moved around at the same time as himself, twin-stick shooter style, almost all of them feel half-baked, meaning whatever class you choose feels too often like playing a dollar store version of Diablo 3 instead of a newer, fresher take on the ARPG formula. Regarding progression, players have their basic skills which are unlocked and improved through leveling up, and are equipped using a pool of skill points which also incrementally increase as you gain levels. This system is actually one of Chaosbane's strongest elements, as it can often make you prioritise your abilities and forces tough decisions regarding which levels of which skills should be equipped. On top of this is the God skill tree, which allows for nodes to be unlocked with favour points earned throughout the game, to add passive abilities and stat boosts to your character. While this really only comes into play properly in the harder endgame content, it's still a decent layer of progression that adds another wrinkle to one of Chaosbane's best features. Unfortunately, such praise cannot be levelled at the game's areas and locations, most of which become frustratingly bland throughout Chaosbane's campaign and post-game content due to what feels like design decisions executed to artificially lengthen the experience. While there is a decent variation of locations, from city streets to snow-covered countryside and everything in between, the need for the player to visit and revisit every single one of these means any innovation or flair soon dulls and eventually gives way to tedium. As an example, one of the first areas you visit is the sewers. Initially, this seems like an interesting and atmospheric area filled with grotesque horrors and dark, intriguing corners. However, over the next set of missions, I was made to revisit this area at least 5 times, and many of these trips presented little to no innovation in the map layout. As expected, boredom soon took root, and it became more and more of a chore to fight through the same areas with the same enemies over and over again. But all is not lost, as another one of Chaosbane's best elements are its boss encounters, and while they're not the greatest the genre has ever seen, they are enjoyable enough that reaching one would often help to alleviate some of the tedium experienced on the way to the encounter. Unfortunately for Chaosbane, these boss fights are few and far between, meaning they only alleviate the problem and cannot come close to solving it. One other area in which any ARPG can often sink or swim is their loot systems. But alas, Chaosbane once again shows little to no innovation here. Much like all of the elements seen so far, it's for the most part competent, with frequent drops and lots of incremental improvements that come your way at a good clip. The problem here is that none of it's particularly exciting, with no real standout UI for rare drops, mediocre armor designs, and little to no gear sets to strive for. While endgame does improve on this slightly, I never felt excited to try out a new piece of gear or felt the pull between a favoured old item and a shiny new one during my time with Chaosbane. Instead, often finding myself just equipping whatever item showed the most green in my inventory and ignoring how it looked or its intricate stat details. Having said this, there are some interesting ideas in the way gear is used when returning to the game's hub area. Essentially, there is no way to sell excess loot in Chaosbane, meaning money can only be picked up from fallen enemies. Instead, you're able to donate gear that you no longer want to an NPC, which will level up the shop area in the game's hub. This eventually leads to better gear options and rewards. It's a nice little variation on the established norm, but much like any innovation seen in Chaosbane, it's fleeting and underdeveloped, essentially meaning that it makes little difference in the end, and you may as well just be selling the gear instead of donating it. Once the main campaign is finished, various other options become available to the player, including a boss rush mode, harder difficulty settings, and relic maps, which sort of function like Diablo 3's adventure mode, but in the form of difficulty-based maps that yield incremental loot upgrades. As ARPG endgame options go, it's a mediocre offering that is unlikely to hold the attention of many, and this will be especially true regarding avid fans of the genre looking for a long-tail endgame. Presentation is a mixed bag in Chaosbane. While graphically it can look great in places with nice lighting, particle and texture work, many of its character and enemy animations can look stiff and jarring, and much of its environments can sometimes seem a little still and lifeless. For example, in Diablo 3, there are often many pieces of terrain that can be destroyed, smashed or run through, which makes you feel like your attacks are having an impact on the world and its inhabitants. But here, other than the odd barrel here and there, very little is destructible or interactive, making it often feel like you're walking around a nice painting rather than a lived-in world. Also, it's worth noting that Chaosbane's UI doesn't do it any favours either, with strangely convoluted menus for gear and abilities, and an unclear orb next to the character's current stats showing level progression. However, by far the most jarring part of Chaosbane's presentation, and also its worst quality in general by a large degree, is its voice acting. While it does vary between characters, with some giving better performances than others, I can safely say without hesitation that this is some of the worst voice acting I have heard in a video game, maybe ever. Such criticism is further amplified by its existence as genuinely unbearable, unlike some of the so bad it's good examples that we've seen in games past.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
I mean, honestly, just listen to this shit.
I don't have the energy. I must first recharge my energy.
It's him.
I don't have the energy.
Very well. I shall speak to Erlanger at once. Where is he?
My link with Athol Lauren is too weak.
Erlanger knows more about the Elven Ruins than anyone else. If anyone knows how to get into the temple, it's him.
My link with Athol Lauren is too weak. All right, Clamped. Show me the map. Oh, I must first recharge my energy.
Truly fucking awful. So bad, in fact, that I had to turn the sound off for large sessions of my time with the game, and that is something that I rarely, if ever, do. Also, in a bizarre turn of events, certain characters such as Alessa would seemingly change to a different voice actor very occasionally, mid-dialogue, and to make things even more confusing, it would also be a male voice in place of her normal female one.
It's him.
While this would indicate a change in the character's gender late in development, it's still a very weird remnant that should have really been eliminated, and serves as yet another jarring element that pulls the player out of the experience. Performance-wise, the game seems to run pretty well on consoles, with slowdown only seen very rarely, regardless of how many enemies are swarming the player. Having said this, it goes without saying that performance will be better on the PC, and despite my snarky intro, I would expect it can be picked up for a similar price there. Still, while playing on consoles is probably the lesser way to experience Chaosbane, it never really feels like a hindrance that would change your entire perception of it. As with many other games in the genre, replay value here is based largely on two elements: the incrementally increasing difficulty, and the notion of re-experiencing the game with a different class. While Chaosbane does offer both, as well as the aforementioned mediocre endgame content, much of it will simply depend on if any of the classes speak to you. For me, they all felt like weak imitations of classes that I'd used in other ARPGs, and did very little to develop the archetypes which they so clearly embodied. While I will say that the recently added Keeler does a lot to freshen things up, I cannot see myself returning to Chaosbane when there are so many other, better options out there, but your mileage may vary. Regarding bugs, I experienced nothing overtly game-breaking in my 30 or so hours, but plenty of small issues that are a little concerning. Stuff like enemies stuck in the environment, Zed fighting on certain textures, and the odd collision issue here and there were the biggest offenders. However, I would say that there are enough issues still present to indicate that bigger problems may still be lurking, and a few more patches may be needed before a bug-free time can be guaranteed. As such, your experience may vary, but at the very least, it's not the biggest offender in the genre in recent years when it comes to bugs. I've seen many reviewers say that while this game is painfully generic, it's enjoyable if you're a Warhammer fan. Well, I'm a Warhammer fan, and it pains me to say that its bland elements are not elevated by the use of the Warhammer IP, but are instead examples of how it's being wasted here. There is so much interesting lore, diverse ideas, and room for innovative design, but none of that has been grasped, and what remains is a safe, passable ARPG that does nothing to stand out from its competition. It may sound like I'm being overtly harsh on Chaosbane, but too often I feel like we're so desperate for a good Warhammer game that the IP is held to a lower standard, and this is in no small part due to how freely the license has been shipped around in recent years. For me, Chaosbane's problem is one of blandness. It's not a terrible game, it's just a bland one that does nothing to progress the ARPG genre or the Warhammer IP, and in many ways that's worse. If the game had been terrible, then at least more passion could be felt towards it. As it stands now, it simply left me numb, and that's a shame, because whatever you say about Warhammer, it's an IP that's identity is at least partially based on leaving a lasting impression. And with the likes of Diablo 3, Path of Exile, and even Grim Dawn all having done what Chaosbane tries, but better over the past decade or so, it becomes a difficult game to recommend. So, when all is said and done, is Martyr better than Chaosbane? Yes. Yes it is. Oh man, I guess I could have just said that at the start.
I must first recharge my energy.